Hey, what's up, A-Push kids? We're back for our next lecture here in AP US History. Today we're going to be covering topic 8.9, The Great Society. We have two learning objectives that we're going to be looking at today. Our first one is objective 8J and then 8K. 8J says, explain the causes and effects of continuing policy debates over the role of the federal government over time. And 8K, explain the continuities and changes in immigration patterns over time. Our first two key ideas are analyze U.S. international and domestic policies, including their influence on technological advancements and social changes during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, and describe the impact of television on American culture, including the presidential debates, news coverage of the civil rights movement, the moon landing, and the war in Vietnam. So we're going to start off kind of this discussion of the political aspects of the 1960s by starting with the election of 1960. Now, the election of 1960 is going to mark a turning point in U.S. politics. Now, in this, the two people running for the presidency are Richard Milhous Nixon and John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, Nixon was the Republican candidate and offered a lot of experience. He had spent 8 years as the vice presidential candidate under Eisenhower. He had a lot of foreign policy experience, or at least claimed to do so during these critical early stages of the Cold War. And he had promised to keep the government spending and the taxes low during this particular time. Now, on the other hand, the Democratic candidate was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, he was incredibly young and offered a lot of not only youth and hope. Many people kind of today in modern times compare kind of his candidacy to that of Obama's, both kind of this idea of hope, youth, and change. Now, he had only served in the Senate for 2 terms, and so he was on a national stage very inexperienced compared to the dearth of experience that Nixon brought. He had no foreign policy experience whatsoever. And kind of working against him as well, it was that at this time, or working against him at that time, was that he was a Catholic. And many people were worried that this would make him somewhat subservient to the Pope and the Catholic Church in Rome. However, he offered a lot of new ideas, which really inspired a lot of people. But most importantly in this campaign was the impact of television. And 1960 was the first time that presidential debates were on TV. And in those debates, Nixon appeared old, slow, and sluggish, while Kennedy appeared youthful. He looked presidential, is what many people said. And the TV debates really helped JFK win the election. And because of this, 1960 is going to really start to mark the beginning of TV's dominance in politics. And so Kennedy wins this election. And so what we start to see is we see the first beginnings of the Kennedy administration. Now, from the Cold War standpoint, JFK is going to take a strong stance against the Soviet Union. Now, he believed that the USSR had more ICBMs. Those are those intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they also had better space technology, which they still kind of did at the beginning of the 1960s, although the United States will actually have more. He was wrong, in fact. What Kennedy is going to advocate for is something called the flexible response to fight the Cold War. More ICBMs, but also a bigger military. Now, what he wanted was what was called this first strike capability against the USSR, rather than Eisenhower's mutually assured destruction. The idea being is that we could develop not only more missiles, but we would be able to hit the Soviet Union first. And so as a result of this, we started to place missile systems around the world, including and secretly in Turkey. Now, Kennedy not only fought the Cold War in this way, but as we've mentioned, and you've had this slide before, he fought it in other ways as well, trying to influence third world countries around the world to align with the United States through the creation of things such as the Peace Corps. In addition to this, ideologically, he also committed to trying and catching the U.S. up to the USSR in space, and launching what was called the space race, to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade and do the other things, as he so said. Now, eventually we would land a man on the moon, just a few months before the deadline of 1970. And TV coverage of that moon landing helped to inspire the nation. And people like Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin landed there towards the end of 1969. This leads us then to key idea number 3. Analyze the international policies and actions taken as a response to the Cold War, including the U.S. involvement in Cuba. Now, JFK's first year in office, he was met by a new premier of the Soviet Union, and that was Soviet leader Nikolai Khrushchev. Now, Nikolai Khrushchev, like his former boss Joseph Stalin, had threatened to cut off access to West Berlin. Now, in response, JFK vowed to never give up access to the city, and in a speech given there, he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am also a Berliner, though he actually mispronounced it and said, "I'm a jelly donut," but that's neither here nor there. However, rather than blockade the city like Stalin had done, and Khrushchev and the other communist leaders decided to build what would become known as the Berlin Wall to keep East Germans out of West Berlin. They had been fleeing there by the hundreds for better jobs and living conditions on the western side of the city. The wall would go up virtually overnight. Now, eventually, this wall, the Berlin Wall, would really come to symbolize the division between the two sides. And although we would refer to this Iron Curtain, the division between the East and the West, between the democracies and the Soviet Union, in a speech given by Churchill many years earlier than this, almost a decade earlier, the Berlin Wall would very much kind of symbolize this. Now, interestingly enough, when I'm recording this video, today is the 20th anniversary when the wall came down. Now, eventually the Berlin Wall would be expanded and would eventually total more than 110 miles. Dozens of people would be killed attempting to cross the stretch in between East and West Berlin, going across electric fences, dodging floodlights, and trying to cross what was called the Death Strip. Now, not only did JFK had to deal with what was happening in Europe, but also his biggest challenge happened with what was happening just 90 miles to the south of Florida. In 1959, Fidel Castro gained control of Cuba. He seized property, much of it owned by U.S. corporations, and took aid from Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. Now, under Eisenhower, the CIA had trained Cuban exiles to invade the island and overthrow Castro. And so, in one of the first actions that Kennedy does, is that he approves this CIA-created plan that had been done under Eisenhower. So in 1961, JFK authorized the plan, but the Bay of Pigs invasion failed after JFK called off the airstrikes on Cuba. Now, as a result of this, the U.S. reputation was severely tarnished, and JFK even had to go on TV and take responsibility for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, this wasn't, though, the only repercussion of this failed invasion of Cuba. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs, the Soviet leader Khrushchev promised to defend Cuba from the United States. In 1962, just a few short months later, U.S. spy planes called the U-2, which flies at extreme altitudes, revealed the beginnings of nuclear missile camps in Cuba. You can see some of those pictures on the slide here. Now, the camps were unfinished, but if assembled, Soviet ICBMs in Cuba would give the USSR a first strike capability on U.S. targets. Now, this was incredibly dangerous because what this meant was that if the Soviets could hit us first before we could launch our stuff at them, this would upset this mutually assured destruction balance. JFK warned that he would not allow nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now, as I previously mentioned, these sites had not yet been completed, and they needed not only to have more construction done on them, but the actual missiles themselves weren't there. It was just the launch facilities. Those missiles themselves were on their way. and Soviet ships escorted by nuclear-equipped submarines soon approached the quarantine line that JFK had set up to prevent the importation of the rest of the nuclear missiles, the fuselages, etc. The world at this point waited for World War III. Khrushchev said that if we stopped or attempted to stop the ships, this would be war. We said that if the ships kept coming, it would be war. Everybody waited for the war to begin. At the last possible second, the standoff ended and a deal was reached. Soviet ships turned around at the last minute, and Khrushchev would remove its missiles from Cuba. Now, in addition, though, JFK promised that the U.S. would not invade Cuba ever again, and we secretly agreed to remove ICBMs that we had placed in Turkey. Now, the crisis ended as a political victory for JFK, but it revealed just how close the two sides had come to nuclear war. Now, JFK, at this point, is a fairly popular president. However, his time will not be long with us. On November 22, 1963, JFK is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Now, the chronology of the events have gone down historically, so we'll just run through them really quickly. He's shot by a man named Lee Harvey Oswald, and so Lee Harvey Oswald is arrested. Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, is sworn in on Air Force One, becoming the next president. And just 2 days later, Oswald is killed by a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby. Now, there's a 10-month investigation that goes on, and what is called the Warren Report, named after Chief Justice Earl Warren, reports that Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman. Now, there's a lot of conspiracy theories around this, especially dealing with Oswald and his trip to Mexico. He meets with Soviet officials. I mean, he does have some support. Jack Ruby has many connections to the mafia. So there's a lot of speculation about really how much help did Oswald have in carrying out the actual assassination. There's also some speculation that Oswald wasn't the only gunman there at that particular time. Unfortunately, we'll never fully know. But what we do know was that we have a new president, and that's Lyndon Baines Johnson. Leading us then to key idea number 5, and Johnson's presidency. It says, liberal ideas found expression in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which attempted to use federal legislation and programs to end racial discrimination, eliminate poverty, and address other social issues. So in 1963, LBJ is going to finish the last year of JFK's presidency. And then he's going to run for president on his own in the 1964 election. Now, his opponent in 1964 was a conservative Republican by the name of Barry Goldwater. Now, Goldwater is going to really represent the beginnings of this new conservatism, all right? And so 64, we really kind of see the beginnings of what we see as the modern-day liberal and the modern-day conservative really begins here. And Goldwater really talks about strongly resisting the USSR with nuclear weapons. Now, LBJ is going to win pretty handily. We can see that Goldwater really just wins the South. He was from Alabama. And LBJ is going to begin his Great Society. It is the broadest series of social reforms since FDR's New Deal. Now, this assassination, though, the martyrdom of JFK, is going to put pressure on Congress. And in 1964, Congress is going to pass the Civil Rights Act. And Lyndon Johnson is going to carry out JFK's War on Poverty. Eventually, he's going to enact his own set of programs called the Great Society. That's going to have both civil rights laws, medical care, environmental issues, and social programs are all going to be tied up in this. Now, the Great Society itself is really tied to this idea that despite this overall affluence in post-war America, especially in the 1950s, there were still these concerns about the prevalence and persistence of poverty as a national problem. Johnson was very much influenced by the concept of liberalism. And this idea of liberalism is the belief in the efficacy or the ability of government power to achieve social goals at home. Now, he is very much influenced by FDR's New Deal. In fact, Johnson had really gotten his start as a congressman from Texas during FDR's reign during the Great Depression. Now, these Great Society programs are going to touch lots of areas: health and welfare, education, the war on poverty, as well as consumer and environmental protections. So we'll touch on a couple of these in some more detail here in just a second. So our first one that we want to look at is we want to look at this war on poverty. Now, one of the major elements was the Economic Opportunity Act, which was passed in 1964. And this does a few things. It creates what's called the Jobs Corps, and this helps to train young people in work skills. It established VISTA, which sent volunteers into poor American communities. And it also created and formed Project Head Start, which funded preschool programs in at-risk communities as well. Not only did the war on poverty not only did he start this war on poverty, but he also attempted to work for better health care for people as well. LBJ and Congress are going to enhance Social Security by establishing Medicare and Medicaid during this particular time. Now, what Medicare does is it provides hospital insurance and low-cost medical care to the elderly, and Medicaid provide health care to the poor. So the way that I've always thought about how you tell the difference between them is you care for the elderly, you aid the poor. So Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor. Now, the Great Society also tried to help with housing as well. For instance, LBJ and Congress are going to appropriate, which means they're going to set aside money to build 240,000 units of low-rent public housing. And he's also going to establish the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, which is a cabinet-level position to attempt to deal with the problems of housing, especially for those that are poor. In addition to this, as part of the war on poverty, he's going to cut taxes and pass the Civil Rights Act. In August of 1964, he's going to push Congress to create the Economic Opportunities Act, provides $1 billion to inner cities. However, the problem with all of his stuff is that the Vietnam War is going to hamper all of his programs. The Great Society will also further define the new split in political parties, as conservatives will say that these things will never be enough, they're way too costly, and liberals will continue to look at the ability of government to solve social problems. Leading us then to key idea number 6. Immigrants from around the world sought access to political, social, and economic opportunities in the United States, especially after the passage of new immigration laws in 1965. Now, as part of the Great Society, we're going to see immigration reform. And so in 1965, they passed what is called the Immigration Act of 1965. And what this does is this is going to open the door for many non-European immigrants to settle in the United States. It's going to roll back and eliminate those immigration quotas that we saw in the 1920s. So that Immigration Quota Act and the National Origins Act of 1921 and 1924, this Immigration Act of 1965 is going to get rid of those. And so we're going to start to see this opening of immigrants and immigration for all of these new groups that had been previously discriminated against, especially Asian immigrants, Latin American immigrants, and Eastern European immigrants. And we're going to see some long-term impacts of this. By the 1980s and 1990s, we're going to see an overall increase in immigration to the United States again, nearly 1 million plus annually. 80% of these immigrants are going to come from Asia and from Latin America. In addition to this, this Immigration Act is going to create family-based migration guarantees. And it's going to basically continue the flow of immigrants from these areas. Sometimes this is referred to as chain migration. Essentially, when you have family members here, it becomes easier for you to bring other family members to the United States. Though, although critics of this oftentimes overlook the long period of time it oftentimes takes people to bring their family members over. Now, this is going to spur both economic and cultural change in the United States, something we're going to touch on in more detail in our next unit in period 9. We'll also add incentives and resources for unauthorized migration. For instance, economic sectors become dependent on unauthorized labor, especially in farming sectors in the United States. And we're going to start to see a lot of mixed status families with people that are both citizens and non-citizens here in the United States. This chart right here just kind of depicts how we see kind of this legal immigration by decade. We see as a result after 1965, we see that the vast increase in immigration into the United States. In addition to this, we start to see how the United States, where immigrants are going to come from, is going to change, all going back to this 1965 law, as we're getting a lot more from the Americas, from South America, and from Asia are coming in, and European and African immigration is pretty low in the United States. All right, well, that ends our lecture for today. So we covered a lot today, pretty long lecture. So just to go over a couple of the big highlights, JFK does a lot in terms of the Cold War. Understand he has both successes and failures, especially in Cuba and with the Berlin Wall. But his assassination is going to spur a lot of social change that LBJ is going to bring about with his Great Society and his war on poverty. However, the spending in the Vietnam War is going to really kind of hamper these things. But it is here where we really see this split between the new conservatives, as highlighted by Barry Goldwater, and the new liberals, as highlighted by Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the new Immigration Act of 1965. So we're going to really start to change immigration to the United States, both who's coming and where they're coming from. Now, don't forget to smash that like and subscribe button. Until next time, go Pack.